What would you do if one day you woke up and the whole world had turned its back on you? A father dies under mysterious circumstances, a cousin betrays with a polished smile, and a young woman is stripped of her honor, cast into the shadows. But the truth does not die. Ilara returns, not for revenge, but to reclaim justice with the silence that forged her strength. Charleston in late spring shimmered with its usual charm. Spanish moss swaying above cobbled streets, magnolia blossoms spreading perfume across quiet neighborhoods, and the soft hush of waves from the nearby harbor murmuring like a secret the city never told. In the heart of this southern grandeur stood the Whitmore Estate, an architectural monument of power built from brick, history, and ambition. Ilara Whitmore, the youngest daughter of the Whitmore bloodline, had grown up within the vaulted halls of this house, where silence echoed louder than words and tradition weighed heavier than love. She had the same pale blue eyes as her father, Richard Whitmore, eyes that seemed always to be watching, even when he was gone. From the day she could walk, she'd been taught how to carry herself with grace, to listen more than speak, and to memorize the language of contracts and compromise before bedtime stories had a chance to matter. Her siblings and cousins moved like seasoned diplomats in the family's political theater. But Ilara, for all her polish, had always seemed just slightly out of step, too idealistic, too gentle, too trusting. Still, Richard had seen something in her, something he never put into words, only into gestures. On her 20th birthday, while others received keys to new cars or foreign apartments, Ilara was given an old, worn pocket watch. It had belonged to him, his father before him, and now to her. The brass casing was dull from decades of use, and a single scratch ran diagonally across its face like a scar that refused to fade. He handed it to her quietly, away from the family's curious eyes, as the dusk slipped through the study's windows. "This isn't a gift," he said, placing it in her palm. "It is a reminder. Time listens better than people do, and it never lies." She remembered nodding, not fully understanding, not yet. But she carried the watch every day after that, tucked inside the breast pocket of her tailored jackets, close to her heart like a talisman. The weight of legacy never left her. She walked through boardrooms under the scrutinizing eyes of men 3 times her age, sat in on negotiations that shaped half the city, and still came home to a dinner table where her voice was politely tolerated but never truly heard. Her father, for all his affection in private, maintained a distance in public, always balancing on the knife's edge between protector and patriarch. But none of that mattered to her then. She believed in the family, believed in the empire they had built, and in her father's quiet belief that she could be its future. She did not yet know that this belief would one day be the very reason they would try to destroy her. The morning her father died, the sky over Charleston was unnaturally bright. Sunlight poured through the high windows of the estate like an accusation. The phone call came at 7:15 a.m., interrupting Ilara's quiet breakfast in the glass-walled solarium, where she often sat alone, sipping black coffee and reading legal journals with the pocket watch ticking softly beside her plate. It was the family attorney, voice brittle with forced calm, informing her that Richard Whitmore's car had veered off a narrow bridge just outside the city and exploded on impact. She did not cry, not then. She stood up too fast, her chair scraping against the marble floor, the porcelain cup tipping over and shattering without a sound. Time did something strange in that moment. The hands on the pocket watch kept moving, steady and indifferent, but everything else in the world slowed to a crawl. By the time she arrived at the scene, there was nothing left to recognize. Only scorched steel, twisted guardrails, and the faint, metallic scent of ash lingering in the breeze. The funeral took place 3 days later, under a sky the color of damp cotton. Ilara wore black silk and silence, her face a mask of composure. The estate filled with mourners, Politicians, bankers, competitors disguised as friends, all murmuring condolences with eyes already calculating the future of Whitmore Holdings. The family stood together in a tightly arranged row, and for the first time in her life, Alara felt like an outsider in her own bloodline. The reading of the will came the following week in her father's study, the same room where he had once placed the pocket watch into her hand. The lawyer's voice was clipped and formal, as if distance could shield them all from the weight of the words. When he spoke her name, Alara did not react, nor when he named her the primary successor to Richard's majority shares and chairmanship. She had suspected it. Her father had never said it aloud, but in the way he had watched her, entrusted her, challenged her, she had known. Others had not. There was a long, thick silence, the kind that feels like it coats the lungs. Then Marcus spoke. His voice was light, almost amused, but his eyes were sharp enough to cut glass. "Well," he said, leaning back in his chair, "she always was his favorite." Some of the others laughed, but it was brittle laughter, cracked and hollow. Marcus's gaze never left her, and beneath the practiced smile, she saw something dark and wounded, something that had been festering for years. He was 10 years older, the golden boy of the family since his teens. He had led mergers, built subdivisions, dined with governors. He had grown up believing the company would be his. And now, with one line from a dead man's will, it was not. Jealousy did not bloom in Marcus. It had always been there, coiled and waiting. The will only gave it permission to rise. The days that followed unfolded with an eerie calm, as if the estate itself were holding its breath. Alara moved through rooms where portraits of ancestors watched with glass eyes, their painted faces locked in silent judgment. She buried herself in transition meetings, corporate memos, and legal assessments, each step forward carrying the subtle resistance of a machinery that did not welcome her hand on its levers. Marcus, on the surface, remained courteous, offering assistance, deferring in public, even congratulating her during a company gala with a smile that curled at the edges like burning paper. But underneath, she began to feel the walls shift. Rumors crept into boardrooms like cold drafts. Whispers of missing funds, irregular audits, obscure transactions linked to her name. At first, she dismissed them as internal noise, nervous reactions to a new leader, to her age, to her presence as a woman in a patriarchal legacy. But then the whispers grew teeth. An anonymous report was submitted to the Internal Ethics Committee. Financial records, doctored with excruciating precision, pointed to a series of offshore transfers originating from accounts under her control. The numbers were clean, the trail was deliberate, and the signatures, her own. She stared at the documents under fluorescent lights in the conference room on the 32nd floor, heart steady, eyes burning. They had forged her, perfectly. Whoever did it had studied her. Her style of approval, her phrasing, the timing of her authorizations. It was not sloppiness, it was a message. She looked up from the papers and saw Marcus standing across the room, pretending to scroll through his phone. When he met her gaze, his expression was a blank pane of glass. That was the moment she knew, not from anything he said, but from the deliberate absence of surprise in his eyes. The investigation was swift. Executives who once applauded her leadership now shifted their tone to caution, then doubt, then cold civility. No one defended her. Not her uncles, not her cousins, not even the executives her father had mentored. They murmured phrases like optics and protecting the company, as though loyalty could be measured in stock stability. But it was her Aunt Vivian who carved the final wound. Once a second mother to her, the woman who had laced up her ballet shoes as a child and brought her chamomile tea during sleepless nights, now sat at the far end of the board table, staring at the ceiling while the vote was taken. And then, with a pen as fine as a needle, she signed the resolution to suspend Alara from all duties indefinitely, pending legal review. As the ink dried, Vivian rose from her seat and passed Alara without meeting her eyes. Only when she was close enough that no one else could hear, she murmured, "Some battles cannot be won with virtue." And then she was gone. Alara sat still, her hands folded on her lap, the pocket watch in her coat pressing against her ribs like a buried scream. In that moment, she understood the weight of the gift her father had given her. Time, relentless and incorruptible, would be her only ally now. Charleston disappeared behind her without ceremony. No farewells, no closure, only the hum of tires against asphalt as she drove west through endless highways and unfamiliar towns. The farther she went, the lighter the air felt, as though even grief could not keep pace with distance. But pain, as she soon learned, is not something that stays behind. It nestles into the chest like dust in old books, quiet, persistent, and impossible to fully remove. She arrived in a small town in northern New Mexico as autumn began to turn the desert winds brittle. There was nothing remarkable about the place, just a scattering of adobe houses, a single diner that closed before dusk, and a bookstore at the end of a street so narrow even the wind passed through quietly. That was where she found her new life, or what could barely be called one. The bookstore was a narrow, crooked building with faded lettering on its windows, and the scent of dry paper and forgotten time. Its owner, an elderly man named Howard, asked no questions when she applied for the job. Perhaps he saw in her the same thing the mirror had begun to reflect back to her each morning. A woman hollowed out, operating on instinct more than purpose. Days blurred into one another. Mornings shelving dusty volumes, afternoons cataloging titles no one would borrow, evenings spent watching the sun dip behind the mountains, painting the town in rust and indigo. The rhythm was slow, and in that slowness, Alara found a strange kind of numbness, like pressing your hand against cold glass until you no longer felt the chill. At night, in the small room she rented above the shop, she wrote. Pages filled quickly, legal notes, timelines, names, shadows of names. Then came the journals, a dozen leather-bound volumes where she recorded not what had happened, but how it had felt. She did not write to make sense of things. She wrote so she would not forget. Forgetting, she feared, was the first step toward becoming no one at all. The pocket watch remained with her, always. Sometimes she would take it out and place it beside her journal, watching the second hand tick forward in the stillness. She did not wind it. She wanted to see how long it would last on what her father had left in it. The days passed, and still it ticked. She did not speak much. Howard would talk about books or weather or old customers, and she would nod, occasionally answer, but never linger in the warmth of conversation. She avoided questions, especially the gentle ones, the ones that sounded like, "Where are you from?" or "What brought you here?" Her name, Alara Whitmore, was left behind in Charleston. Here she was just Alara, no last name, no empire, no past. And yet, even in anonymity, she could feel the story inside her, refusing to die. It curled at the edges of her silence, tugging at her in dreams where her father stood at the edge of a burning bridge, always just out of reach. The truth had not gone anywhere. It was still there, like the weight of the watch against her chest, like the ache that never left her shoulders. She had been erased by lies, but something within her refused to vanish. Something that whispered, quietly but constantly, that she was still more than the version of herself they had tried to destroy. It began, not with a plan, but with a question. One night, as the wind pressed softly against the windows and the desert outside lay still under a silver moon, Alara sat at her desk, surrounded by the silence of too many unwritten thoughts. She had opened a book on criminal procedure to pass the time. Howard had left it on the counter earlier that day with a half smile and the casual remark, "Might interest you more than dusty poetry." At first she read out of habit, the way one might trace an old scar, but soon her eyes slowed, her breath steadied, and something inside her sharpened. She kept reading. That book led to another, and then to others she ordered under a different name. Titles on forensic accounting, federal case law, corporate fraud, document authentication. Each volume held pieces of a puzzle no longer abstract. Each chapter whispered the same, unrelenting truth. She had been framed, but the construction of that lie could be undone. The realization came gradually with the weight of something unignorable. If she wanted justice, she would have to carve the path herself. No one from Charleston was coming. No miracle was waiting. What they had taken from her was not only her reputation, but her right to be believed. If she was to rise, it would have to be through knowledge, undeniable, precise, and cold as steel. Howard noticed the change. He was a man who had spent decades in the quiet trenches of appellate law before trading courtrooms for the smell of old books and peace. For weeks, he said nothing, only watching as she took notes, highlighted texts, and began sketching timelines on the back of unused receipts. Then, one afternoon, as they were shelving a new delivery of legal anthologies, her choice, he asked, "You always this curious, or is this personal?" She looked at him, long and steady. "Personal." He nodded, as if that word alone explained everything. And perhaps it did. From that moment on, something shifted between them. He stopped treating her like a shadow behind the counter. Instead, he became her reluctant guide. He lent her his old annotated law books, debated with her over civil versus criminal liability, and taught her how to dissect a deposition like peeling back layers of rot. Sometimes, in the quiet hours between closing and sleep, he would talk about the cases that had broken him, the corruption he had seen, the truths that never reached daylight. And in return, she told him pieces, never names, never places, just shapes of betrayal, the geometry of loss, the calculus of injustice. He never asked for more. That, perhaps, was why she began to trust him. Courage did not return all at once. It came in fragments, moments when her voice did not shake as she read aloud a statute, or when she caught herself thinking not just of what had been done to her, but of what she could now do in return, not for vengeance, for truth. The pocket watch stayed by her side, ticking steadily once more. She had started winding it again, not because she needed it to tell time, but because she was not ready to let it go silent. And so, in the back room of a forgotten bookstore in a desert town no one remembered, a woman the world believed erased began to rebuild herself, not with fury, but with focus. One paragraph at a time, one truth at a time, one breath, one step, one buried name at a time. The call came in the late hours of a windswept evening, when the town was asleep and even the desert seemed to hold its breath. Ilara had just finished organizing a folder of research, loose papers fanned across her desk like the remnants of a storm. Her phone vibrated once, an unknown number flashing on the screen. She let it ring twice before answering. At first there was only silence. Then a voice, hesitant and low. "I do not know if you remember me. My name is Daniel Kessler. I worked in financial compliance at Whitmore Holdings 5 years ago." Her pulse quickened, though she kept her voice steady. "I remember." He exhaled, the sound thin and tight with guilt. "I should have spoken sooner, but they buried me. Fired me without cause, made sure I could not work again. I had a wife, a son. I could not—" "What changed?" she asked quietly. A pause. Then, "He left something on my desk the day I was escorted out. I do not think he meant to. A flash drive. I kept it hidden all these years. I listened to it again last week, and I thought of you. He sent the file that same night." She sat there in the dark, listening. The voice was unmistakable. Marcus, calm, confident, speaking of shifting funds for the sake of appearances, of manufacturing a paper trail that would make Ilara the fall girl if it ever came to it. Another voice responded in the background, hesitant but complicit. There were dates, project codes, references only someone inside the machine could understand. It was not just damaging, it was surgical, precise, irrefutable. The weight of it pressed down on her chest like gravity had increased. Not rage, not sorrow, just the quiet understanding that the moment she had prepared for was no longer hypothetical. The following morning, she stood before Howard in the back room of the bookstore, holding the flash drive in one hand and the pocket watch in the other. "I need to go back," she said. He looked at her for a long time, then nodded once. "Then go back as who you are now, not who they remember." She left 3 days later. No announcement, no farewell. The desert receded behind her like a long-held breath, and the highway stretched forward, familiar and foreign at once. She had not seen Charleston in nearly half a decade, but as the skyline rose once more beyond the marshes and pines, it was not fear that filled her. It was clarity. In the suitcase at her side were organized binders of evidence, timelines cross-referenced with financial records, and the original audio file backed up 6 times over. In her coat pocket, her father's watch ticked beside her heart, steady and sure. She did not arrive as a ghost. She arrived as a reckoning. And though no one in the Whitmore family knew it yet, the voice they had buried was already walking through their front door. Charleston greeted her with polite hostility. The city had not changed. Its oak-lined avenues still whispered old secrets, and the Whitmore name still opened doors, even if it now echoed with something brittle beneath its weight. But Alara walked those streets differently. She did not slip into the estate quietly or try to reclaim what was taken with ceremony. She went to court. The civil lawsuit was filed within 48 hours of her return. Her name, Alara Catherine Whitmore, appeared in bold across the front page of the local paper, alongside headlines that smelled of scandal and family warfare. But beneath the sensationalism, her petition was precise, unflinching. Willful defamation, financial manipulation, obstruction of internal audits, conspiracy to commit fraud. Marcus Whitmore named explicitly. 3 board members, including the family's longtime legal advisor, named alongside him. The media pounced. Journalists flocked to courthouse steps, hungry for comment, for cracks in her composure. News segments rotated old photographs of her at galas, at ribbon cuttings, standing beside her father, the young heir, the fall, the return. But Alara gave them nothing more than stillness. She showed up in a dark suit, spoke only when necessary, and looked directly into the cameras without blinking. Marcus, as expected, played his part with flair. He held a press conference 2 days after the lawsuit was announced, standing in front of the Whitmore headquarters with a sympathetic smile and eyes that gleamed too much. "My cousin has clearly suffered," he said, voice measured, hand pressed delicately to his chest. "And I hope she finds peace. But these accusations, these fabrications, serve no one but her bitterness." He spoke of mental strain, of grief clouding judgment. He alluded to misunderstandings and deep family pain. He framed himself not as a villain, but as the loyal steward left to pick up the pieces when others collapsed. Cameras flashed as he stepped down, each angle carefully curated. But he underestimated what 5 years of silence had taught her. Inside the courtroom, Alara was not poetic. She was forensic. Every claim she made came with exhibits, timestamps, cross-referenced emails, and the cold, undeniable voice of Marcus, implicating himself on a drive now verified by forensic audio experts. When his lawyers tried to discredit her, she met their questions with calm precision, no hesitation, no theatricality. The courtroom was not her battlefield. It was her proving ground. Her former relatives watched from the gallery, some wide-eyed, others grim. A few avoided her entirely in public, unsure whether to root for her or for the myth they had helped preserve. Her Aunt Vivian never once made eye contact. Each day in court chipped away at the facade Marcus had spent years polishing. By the 3rd week, the defense had stopped mentioning her emotional instability. By the 5th, they abandoned character attacks altogether. He had built his case on perception, and perception could not survive evidence. And still, Alara never raised her voice. She let facts speak louder, let truth be the sharpest instrument in the room. Outside, reporters waited for a glimpse of conflict, of tears, of some fracture in her composed frame. but all they saw was a woman walking out of the courthouse each evening with a leather satchel over her shoulder and a brass pocket watch tucked quietly into her coat, its steady ticking unheard beneath the noise, but always, always moving forward. The trial, though civil in nature, unfolded like a slow, methodical unmasking. Over the course of 4 long months, testimony by testimony, the carefully stitched fabric of Marcus's empire began to unravel. Former employees, some emboldened by Alara's resolve, others subpoenaed against their will, spoke of strange omissions, whispered instructions, documents that vanished after late-night calls. For years, Marcus had crafted the illusion of control, but illusions, Alara knew, were always most fragile when held too tightly. The recordings became the spine of the case, verified, time-stamped, unedited. In them, his voice was confident, almost casual. He did not sound like a man burdened by conscience. He sounded like someone too certain he would never be caught. His language was precise, managerial. He never said her name, not directly, but he did not need to. Every decision, every shadow move was aimed at making Alara the scapegoat for financial irregularities he orchestrated. His downfall was not thunderous. It was quiet, a shift in the air, a verdict read aloud under the sterile glow of courtroom lights. His name, followed by the words, liable for damages, fraudulent misrepresentation, permanently removed from all Whitmore corporate holdings. Alara sat still through the reading, her hands folded, her breath measured. There was no satisfaction, only the stillness that comes when something long pursued has finally stopped running. Marcus did not look at her as he stood to leave, flanked by his attorneys. His expression was hollow, as if he had not expected to lose, not truly. The board of directors convened an emergency meeting that evening. The seat her father once held was offered to her again, this time without contest. She declined, not out of spite, but clarity. That place no longer belonged to her, or rather, she no longer belonged to it. In the days that followed, statements were issued, apologies printed, whispers transformed into apologies behind closed doors. But one conversation stayed with her. It happened in the corridor outside the courtroom on the final day. Vivian stood by the window, her posture stiffer than Alara remembered. When she turned, there was no performance, no veiled superiority, no calculated poise, only age and regret, wearing her features thin. "I thought silence would protect the family," she said, voice faint, but it only protected the lie. Alara did not respond at first. She studied the woman who had once tied ribbons in her hair, taught her how to play piano, and signed her exile without blinking. Then she nodded once, not in forgiveness, but in acknowledgement. Vivian lowered her eyes as if the silence was the worst answer of all. That night, back in her father's study, long untouched, still dim with the scent of old leather and cedar, Alara stood by the desk where he once handed her the pocket watch. She took it out, held it in her palm, and listened. The ticking was soft but relentless. She did not cry. There were no tears left to honor what had been taken. But in the quiet rhythm of the watch, she imagined her father standing there beside her, proud not of vengeance, but of the dignity she had kept intact through the fire. And in that silence he nodded, not with words, but with time. Her name returned to the world not with triumph, but with stillness. The newspapers that had once devoured her downfall now printed retractions in measured tones, neatly tucked between headlines about rising markets and political shifts. Her face, once splashed across scandal and shame, now re-emerged as the symbol of a wrong righted. But Alara did not celebrate. The truth, when it came, did not restore what had been lost. It only stopped the bleeding. The board offered her everything: full control of Whitmore Holdings, her father's title, a seat of unquestioned power. The offer was public, ceremonial, and laced with the kind of reverence that once would have meant everything to her. She declined. The rejection was quiet, given in a closed-door meeting with no cameras, no fanfare. She simply said, "This was never the empire I wanted," and left them sitting in silence, unsure whether to feel dismissed or relieved. Instead, she took the settlement awarded by the court and built something of her own, a legal fund, small at first, quietly formed and privately supported, dedicated to victims of wrongful accusation, people like her whose truths had been buried beneath influence, fear, and convenience. The cases came slowly at first. Whispered referrals passed from one invisible hand to another. But in time, the fund grew, its reach stretching into courtrooms Ilara would never enter herself, giving voice to those the world had chosen not to hear. One morning, weeks after the judgment, she received a request through the prison's administrative office, Marcus. The name alone tugged at old wounds, but she said yes. The visitation room was stark and fluorescent, built for function, not comfort. He entered in the plain gray uniform of his new reality, thinner now, with shadows beneath his eyes that had nothing to do with poor lighting. He sat across from her, folding his hands carefully on the table, as though ritual still mattered. They sat in silence for a long moment. The ticking was gone here, no watch allowed inside, but she felt it anyway. "I thought you would save me," he said finally, barely louder than a breath. She studied him. Not with hatred, not even with grief, but with the distance one feels looking at a painting long since faded. "I once thought you were family," she replied, her voice soft, almost kind. Marcus said nothing more. There was nothing left to say. When she left the facility, the sun outside was blinding in its brightness. She stood in it for a moment, eyes closed, face tilted upward, letting the warmth settle on her skin like the first breath after surfacing from deep water. Forgiveness, she had learned, was not the act of forgetting. It was the decision to no longer be chained to the memory. It was not absolution. It was release. And in walking away from Marcus, from what he had done, from what they had all become, she did not grant him freedom. She gave it to herself. The drive out to the estate was quiet, the kind of silence that no longer felt heavy. The trees lining the long road had begun to turn, their leaves painted in amber and rust, fluttering like slow confessions on the breeze. The gates, once guarded and pristine, now stood ajar, the paint peeling at the edges. No one had lived here since the trial. The house was empty, not just of furniture or people, but of purpose. Ilara parked beneath the canopy of oaks and walked the familiar path up to the front door. It opened with a groan, the scent of dust and old wood, rising like memory. She did not wander. She moved through the house as if through a dream already remembered. The echo of her footsteps across the marble floor followed her up the stairs, down the west corridor, and into her father's study. The room was untouched, sealed by time. Books still lined the shelves, though their spines had faded. The leather chair faced the window, the desk bare except for a small empty tumbler that had once held his nightly bourbon. She stood in the center of the room, the air thin with late light, and faced the mirror that hung above the fireplace. For a long while, she simply looked. The reflection held no secrets now, no girl reaching for approval, no heir molded by legacy, no victim of betrayal. The woman who met her gaze was not trying to prove anything. She did not need to. She had walked through fire and winter and silence and returned not to reclaim the house behind her, but to stand whole before herself. She reached into her coat and pulled out the pocket watch. It was warm from her body, the brass dulled but still solid in her palm. She opened it. The ticking was steady, soft as breath. The time no longer mattered, only the sound. She stood there until the sun dipped low enough to fill the study with gold, casting long shadows across the walls. And then, for the first time in a very long while, she sat in her father's chair. Not as his daughter, not as his successor, but as herself. That evening, back in her apartment, she opened her journal, its leather worn at the corners, its pages filled with years of questions and reckonings, and wrote one final line. "Time does not heal, but it gives us the stillness to learn how to live with our wounds."